Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Juliet and I live in the beautiful steamy mountains of Colorado, about 170 miles from Denver, in a very remote old miner's log cabin that was built in the early 1800s. It possesses a great deal of rustic charm and character so commonly seen in older buildings that bear the hallmark of a long history behind them. I have always preferred old homes because the character and energy from eras gone by somehow is entrenched in the atmosphere of a building, much like when you see an old long-lived tree that has well outlived us and stands tall, proudly and majestic, towering into the heavens in splendid repose. People so often run their hands down these massive trunks of these aged trees in awe and fascination, intrigued and seemingly mesmerized by something that has possibly lived generations before they were even born. Quite a sobering thought, really. Back to my story, which happened in the summer of 2003. I live on a high mountainous elevation surrounded by acres of natural forest, largely comprised of bristlecone pines, aspen trees, blue spruce, white firs, and limber pines. I live way off the beaten track with no neighbours for miles around, and it literally takes me 45 minutes to climb down our high hilly elevation in order to get to the dirt road that virtually takes us into Denver from all our shopping excursions. The one question I get asked by so many is, why do I live in such a remote area so far away from everything? And the answer is because I love it out here. I've never ever been interested in large crowds and hectic schedules, but love the freedom and spontaneity of life out here, and I enjoy and respect all the animal life that frequent our woods. And believe me, we have many animals here, from raccoons, squirrels, white-tailed deer, moose, and the list goes on forever, including the obvious predators like coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, black bears, and bobcats. I've always wanted to raise my girls in this beautiful country air, and after my husband died so tragically 5 years ago in a small plane accident, I knew that this kind of lifestyle would be perfect to raise my kids, whom I chose to homeschool, so we could embrace this amazing lifestyle together. I have 2 girls at the time, Erica, who was 12, and Linda, who was 15. My story begins when one night after eating dinner and sitting by the fire playing cards and drinking hot chocolate, we were startled by the most terrifying noise on our cabin. It truly sounded like a herd of rhinos was charging our cabin in a thunderous rage. Everything was rattling, shaking and vibrating as if our house had been hit by a violent tornado. Whatever this thing was, it was monstrously big. We could not imagine what this thing could possibly be. Moose can sometimes make a loud noise if they bump into your cabin accidentally, and they rattle it for a bit. But this was no moose, nor was it a black bear. We could not imagine what we were dealing with. This thing, whatever it was relentless in its banging, and truly I felt like a mouse in a small hole being ambushed by hundreds of cats that were about to prize me out with their paws, and there was no hope of escape. My children were absolutely terrified and were certain that we were going to be eaten by this mysterious predator, but I assured them I would kill it instantly if it dared to break into our home with my 9mm revolver. As you can imagine, we could not call law enforcement because it would have taken them at least 2 hours just to get to our house. Yet my confidence was at an all-time low because somehow the energy of this thing was extremely powerful. It made those low guttural growls and grunts that were so piercing they literally went right through me. All I knew in my heart that was pounding violently in my chest was that I wanted to scream out as loud as I could, but I bit my tongue because I did not want to escalate the inevitable terror that my children were clearly feeling by letting them know just how terrified I actually was. It was an awful predicament to be in. I'm glad to say eventually the creature just went away, and we were so relieved. But I never got to a stitch of sleep that night, for the fear of this creature had just robbed me of any of that. The following morning I noted the damage caused by the animal that had completely vandalized the sides of our house, disturbing the filler between the wooden beams, as well as lifting large sections of wood off the timber. I knew that the creature must have been at least 8 foot tall, judging by the height of the damage, and at least 500 pounds. We also saw 16-inch muddy footprints in the soil. We knew that whatever this thing was, it was most certainly a monster. We had always felt safe until then in the woods, so for a while we felt a little unsettled in our home, as you can imagine. But a couple of weeks later, normality did resume in our home, and thoughts of the terrifying creature had been tucked away in our minds and hopefully long since forgotten. It was on a Sunday morning I decided that we should go for a hike in the woods and take a lovely picnic, and that's exactly what we did. I made some ham and cheese rolls, potato crisps, chocolate brownies, and packed bottles of Coca-Cola, and off we went on our hiking trip. I parked my car close to the hiking trail, and I carried my 9mm gun with me, some bear spray, and an air horn. I have to say it was such a gloriously beautiful day, and it was a day that needed to be spent outdoors. The woods were so pretty and dappled with glorious sunlight that literally twinkled cheerfully through the forest canopy, and there was such a happy ambience in the wood. We watched a cheeky little squirrel teasing a couple of turkeys by darting up and down the tree, and they were loving the interaction. I promise you, turkeys do feel incredible joy. I witnessed it that morning. My children and I were laughing so much, and we sat down on the clearing to eat a light luncheon. As we were eating, I suddenly had a very ominous feeling that something was incredibly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what that actually was. I know I should have listened to my gut immediately, but I pushed my reservations away, telling myself very sternly to stop being so melodramatic. Yet I could not stop those uneasy feelings from resurfacing and re-emerging like an uninvited guest that was robbing us of having a good time. Quite suddenly it seemed like the sparkling sunlight had faded to be replaced by a bleak darkness that seemed to creep over the forest like a meandering grey foggy cloud. I noticed everything had become incredibly still and deathly quiet, almost as if the sound system in the forest had been switched off for an instant. Suddenly we smelt the most repugnant, vile smell that you could ever imagine smelling, and it literally caused our eyes to water and our noses to burn. In the dark shadows of the forest, I suddenly saw something watching me, and it was monstrously huge. It was eyeing me through the brush, and its eyes were so piercing they physically felt like laser beams going through your body. This colossal, abhorrent creature had such a formidable, menacing presence that felt incredibly evil. So I told my kids that we needed to make tracks and get back to the car because I sensed a horrible malaise in the woods. It was not long before we came to a spot on the forest floor where the whole area was literally covered with about 80 rounds of large shotgun shells, almost as if someone had engaged in a major shootout, and the shells were scattered in all kinds of precarious directions. And my first horrified thought was, what in God's name happened here? I then discovered a shoe lying on the ground, a torn, bloody T-shirt, and a large human femur bone. As you can imagine, I knew at once that this person had engaged in a shootout and had ended up dead after trying to defend himself from a deadly predator. It was the most horrifying revelation, and my children and I just looked at each other in absolute disbelief, hardly daring to believe what we were just witnessing. Suddenly something started to throw large rocks at us, and then I turned around to see the most hideous evil creature you could ever imagine laying eyes on. This creature was an anachronism to our world, but it is what you would expect to see stalking up the very flames of hell with a pitchfork. There was not an ounce of kindness or compassion in those brown eyes that glowed with a menacing red eyeshine. He was covered all over with coal-black hair that was so black it was almost blue. It looked like the Incredible Hulk in its monstrous size, and it was easily over 9 foot tall and 800 to 900 pounds and 5 to 6 feet wide. The creature could have easily taken down a tiger and won that battle with no problems at all. That is how powerful he appeared to me. The only way I can describe him is looking like a giant-like, human-like ape who wanted to leave at once, and his expression said only one thing to us, and it was, "Get out!" I just froze and could hardly move. I was so incapacitated by the most horrifying fear, so my children literally pulled me forwards, but they were beginning to run, which I knew was the very worst thing that they could do, because that creature would immediately attack us if we started running away, which is an instinctive reaction from most predators. I had no doubt about that in my mind. I could hear the creature growling with a low guttural growl, and heavy breathing, making the strangest cacophony of sounds, and I started to scream at the creature, shouting at the top of my lungs for it to shut up and to go away. "Shut up! Go away! Shut up! Go away! Go away!" And for a moment the creature did shut up, but it still threw stones at us. But finally we made it back to the car, and I got inside and just raced away, not daring to look back even once. I did have the human femur bone in my basket, along with the bloody T-shirt and shoe, as well as the gunshot casings, and we drove to the police station immediately to tell them what we had found in the woods, but I made no mention of the ape-like humanoid in case they thought it was that I was some kind of a crackpot, or nutcase, so to speak. The police checked the area thoroughly and did a whole investigation, and I gather they believe the death was caused by a rogue wild animal, like a mountain lion, but there was no mention or ever even suggestion that the creature was actually a Bigfoot, although there may be people who were in the force who had their suspicions about that, but wisely kept their mouths shut at the time. All these years later, the human femur bone, bloody T-shirt and missing shoe were finally identified as belonging to a lone hunter who had gone deer hunting in the woods close to my cabin and subsequently went missing and sadly never returned home. So my heart goes out to that poor, poor family. You would think my stories of cryptid tales would end here, but sadly you would be very wrong. Living where I do in the middle of nowhere means I have seen things that would make your hair curl, and that cannot be rationally explained. Some of them that I just can't even begin to describe. Several weeks after our Bigfoot experience on that hiking trail, my daughters and I were coming back from a shopping trip to Denver, as Linda was now turning 16. We wanted to celebrate her birthday in style by inviting people to a barbecue the following weekend. We needed to do a whole lot of grocery shopping, buying beef patties, chicken drumsticks, and all kinds of goodies that you invariably always need for a festive party. My children and I got carried away on our shopping trip to Denver, a rather unfortunate side effect of a female shopper with an eager eye for a good deal. I was buying a very pretty dress for my daughter to wear for her special day, and time just ticked by so very fast. I'm not the most confident nighttime driver at the very best of times, but it had grown dusky incredibly fast, so I had no choice but to make the journey home with considerable less visibility on the roads. Some of those roads at dusk are so treacherous, let me tell you. We were about 15 minutes from our remote cabin on the dirt road when my highlights lit up this enormous, most terrifying beast standing in the middle of the road. What on earth was this dreadful thing? I wondered to myself in horror. There are no words to describe this hideous, malevolent beast to you, because if it had worn a pair of horns, I would have believed it was the devil himself staring at me face to face. That is how terrifying this encounter actually was. This was, however, not to be the case. This hideously demonic-looking beast was absolutely colossal in size and had the distinct facial appearance of a large black German Shepherd dog. Only this creature's head was about twice the size of a German Shepherd's head. It was bipedal and walking on 2 long legs. I would say it was about 7 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and 300 to 400 pounds. One thing that horrified me was the long paws that it possessed and the sharpest talons it had that I have ever seen, that would literally shred you apart without any problems. This creature glared at me with a pair of monstrous red eyes. It snarled and curled back its hungry lips to reveal the grisliest-looking dagger-like incisors that I have ever seen in my entire life. I slowed down the car and suddenly braked, only because if I tried to run it down, I figured that it would only serve to antagonize the creature further, causing me greater problems. All I remember is that this horrifying thing was parked in the middle of the road like a frozen statue, not moving at all. It then let out a ferocious growl that sounded exactly like a lion, and it was so horrifying in its volume and its intensity that my 2 sleeping kids arose from their sleep, and when they saw the creature in the road, they were screaming at the top of their lungs, "Go, Mum! Go! Go! Please go!" I pressed down the accelerator and nearly ran down the creature, but it dived onto the bonnet, and he was growling at us through the windscreen and walking all over my moving vehicle while I was driving, never losing its balance once. My kids continued to shriek, encouraging me to rev up the engine, which is what I did in the hope that the increased speed would cause the creature to fall off the car. "Go, Mum! Go! Go! Go now!" We got to the mountainous embankment that takes us 45 minutes to climb up in order to get back to our cabin, so that is a long journey. So I had to park my car, and we did sit there in silence, and no one said a word, because the terror in my car was so incredibly electric, you could literally feel it. That's how palpable it was. To be safe, I waited for a good hour with the kids in the car to make sure the creature was actually gone. Everything outside was so still and quiet, and I heard no owls, coyotes, or even crickets, but I wasn't even thinking about that at the time, which on reflection was exceedingly foolish of me, because that should have warned me that something was seriously wrong. Finally, with a cautious act of willful courage and looking over both of my shoulders earnestly, I finally opened the car door very, very slowly and quietly stepped out. My wise daughter Linda begged me to call the police and for us to stay in the car until they came, even if we had to stay there all night long. But I saw no signs of the ugly critter, so I told my children it had gone and it was now terribly safe, but I spoke too soon. I proceeded to gather all the shopping bags that contained the meat packages because I knew they needed urgent refrigeration. My anxious children warily climbed out of the car, their senses heightened by extreme fear. Suddenly I was ambushed as out of the shadows the creature reappeared like a demon from the fires of hell. He pounced off the car roof with the agility of a domestic cat and mounted me, straddling me down like a lion mounting its kill. Shopping parcels flew into the air like leaves in the wind, littering the ground with withered pieces of plastic. Colossal dagger-like claws lunged towards my jugular with clear intentions of ripping it out. Instinctively I protectively covered my neck with my hands, screaming at the top of my lungs, "No! Please, no! No, please!" Sharp incisors pierced into my forearm, so I released my hold over the jugular. The pulsating, throbbing pain momentarily suspended my terror. Linda was throwing parcels at the creature. "Stop!" she shouted. "Please stop!" she screamed. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" Don't hurt my mother, please! No, don't, please! Suddenly the intoxicating meaty smells of my meat-like parcels permeated the air with their tempting aromas, successfully enticing the dog-like beast away from me and loosening its hold of me. It bolted towards the parcels like a rabid dog, shredding the meat apart like an apex predator and ravenously wolfing down chicken drumsticks, burger patties, and heavy steaks. Surging with adrenaline, my heart beating violently in my chest, I sprinted back to my car, hurling myself into the driver's seat and pressing down the accelerator so fast and driving off while my tyres squeaked, leaving the creature to its Armageddon of shredded plastic packages and bloody meat. I parked my car 15 minutes away from my home. My daughters and I were shaking violently, and we called the police in a state of heightened terror. We waited for them to arrive, and it was the longest, most terrifying wait of our entire life, as every second was like a lifetime. Terrified that the creature would return like a nasty boomerang, between tears and shaking, we remained seriously locked up in our cars, refusing to leave for any reason. We were not taking any more chances. The officers did finally arrive and were absolutely appalled by the scratch marks on the car that were so deeply entrenched in the metal, causing significant damage as long lines of paint had been removed in sharp, lengthy lines. The officers even looked at me and said, "Ma'am, what the heck did you encounter tonight? I've never seen anything so bad like this. You must have encountered a monster out there." Even areas on the roof had been dented by the creature's heavy weight. My weeping bite marks had become very infected, inflamed, swollen and puffy, and a visit to my doctor had him asking all kinds of awkward questions that I did not want to answer. If I told him what I'd encountered, I doubted he would have believed me. He said my bite mark was unlike anything he'd ever witnessed, and I was exceedingly lucky to be alive. I received shots and, of course, antibiotics, and believe me, for 6 months after the event, my arm continued to ache and sometimes was even too hard to lift. I would experience shooting pains, and it was just awful for a very, very long time, because that's how bad the bite actually was. I'm sure you and your listeners possibly think that I'm barking mad not to have sold my house immediately after such a harrowing and bad year in 2003, and maybe I was mad, but I'm pleased to inform you that after that I never had any encounters with either of those two cryptid creatures ever again, and hope I never do. Besides, I refuse to be driven away from my home, which I love. As far as those things are concerned, I'm more than certain that these creatures are living out there in those forests, and I think there are more creatures like that around that literally defy rational explanation and human understanding. Since that experience, nothing surprises me anymore. All I would say to all your listeners is to never underestimate these creatures, because they are terribly sly and incredibly intelligent, seemingly not of this world. I would like to find out if any of your listeners possibly believe that I may have encountered a dog man on my second encounter, or was it something else? I would like to point out I do not remember a tale, but my youngest daughter does say the creature did have one, so I'm going to believe her on that. So all these years later, I still live in my beautiful country abode with my new husband, whom I married 10 years ago. My kids have left home now, but visit me very regularly. I truly believe those shopping bags of meat saved my life that day, so I'm grateful that I live to fight another day. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Tom, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early 60s, when I was about 14 years old at the time. I grew up in a very small rural town in West Virginia, where most of the houses were Mediterranean split-level homes that were superbly plastered and often painted in bright, bold colours, all with their own swimming pool in the backyard, which was always incredibly well landscaped and filled with gorgeous, colourful blooms of sweet-smelling flowers. We lived on a large white gravel road, but on either side of the road were residential homes. Our houses were all set against panoramic masterpieces of nature, such as high-rise mountains, emerald green rolling hills, and literally acres and acres of lush green forest that literally went back for so many miles. It truly was an idyllic lifestyle, close to all the kinds of hiking trails, beautiful silvery lakes, and wonderful forests to explore. As is the case in every small town, there are always the invariable cantankerous characters living there that you would really rather avoid in every conceivable situation. We were unfortunate enough to live next door to the town's most disagreeable man, old Mr. McGregor, who was so miserable that he never wore a smile for a single day in his life. In light of that, we would avoid an encounter with the morose, murky man whenever possible, which was exceedingly difficult for us, as he lived next door. My story begins when my brother and I would play with a soccer ball in our backyard, and one day the ball shattered Mr. McGregor's kitchen window. The next thing we knew, the colourless, humourless man, devoid of even an ounce of charm, was hammering at our front door with his fists. He was a very tall man, with an exceedingly gaunt face, brown, beady, hostile eyes, hollowed-out cheekbones, and a scrawny body, where his drab beige clothes hang off his body loosely like a scarecrow. My mother answered the door to Mr. McGregor. "Hello, Mr. McGregor," she said. "So lovely to see you this morning." "Your children are out of control," he barked. "They have broken my window. I will be sending you the bill at once." "Of course," said my mother. "We will gladly pay. I assure you, Mr. McGregor, it was just an accident. My boys didn't mean what happened." "I'll be confiscating their soccer ball," he said. "Kids need to learn that rough behaviour is not acceptable in a residential area," he said, clutching the ball very tightly and walking away, bouncing the ball in his hands. So with our ball being confiscated, my brother and I decided to ride our bikes that afternoon. And then I accidentally rode over a few of Mr. McGregor's newly planted summer seedlings, and the man was incandescent with rage. Once again, Mr. McGregor was pounding on our front door, screaming obscenities at my mother, which was so ironic since he was telling her how badly behaved her kids were, but his own behaviour suggested he needed to learn some self-control as far as his loose tongue was concerned. "Your son deliberately rode over my seedlings," he snapped. "I will be sending you another bill. I have confiscated your children's bikes. They need to learn to respect other people's property, especially the property of their elders." As you can imagine, I was utterly devastated that Mr. McGregor had the brass balls and the sheer audacity to lay claim to our prized possessions, even if it was only temporary. Who knew how long it would take for him to return our items, if he ever actually finally did? So it was that my brother and I hatched a plan to retrieve our bikes and our soccer ball from Mr. McGregor's yard shed that very evening. We anticipated that when he finally retired to bed, that would be the perfect time, so that is exactly what we did, much to the vexation of Mr. McGregor, who regarded us with extreme indignation when he realised we had retrieved our belongings so effortlessly easily from his backyard, when his back was invariably turned. We rode past his house with our bicycle bells tinkling and waving our arms tauntingly and saying, "Hello, Mr. McGregor! It's so good to see you this morning," in provocative voices that had Mr. McGregor waving his fists angrily at us in a furious mood. "You'll not get away with this, boys," he barked angrily as we rode away on our bikes down the white gravel road, literally relishing in Mr. McGregor's irritation. The following morning we heard Mr. McGregor ramming violently on our front door again, and by the look of his purple face, he was furious. My mother groaned. "What have you boys done now?" she sighed, opening the door to the man who was incandescent with rage all over again. And he thundered in the living room like a trampeding elephant, literally shaking everything in its wake. Despite being a very lean man, even my mother's ornate vase was rattling on the table under the vibration of Mr. McGregor's booming voice. "Your children have gone way too far now, and I've got a good mind to report them to the police for such insolent childlike pranks. I blame you as the parent, failing to enforce discipline on such atrocious behaviour." "Sorry, Mr. McGregor. You've lost me," said my mother. "What did you say that my kids have done now?" "All the banging, all the crashing last night, of course. Your children were on my roof, making a raucous commotion and wearing the most god-awful gorilla costume. Not to mention they were throwing rotten eggs all over the place, because the place ponged to high heaven. I know the smell of a rotting egg anywhere, let me tell you." "Is this true?" asked my mother, eyeing my brother and I curiously. "Did you go making noises on Mr. McGregor's roof last night to scare him? Because if you did that, that was exceedingly horrible of you. I did not raise you to be unkind and inconsiderate like that. Did you do this, boys? I need you to own up right now." "Of course not," my brother and I chimed in together. "We were sleeping, Mr. McGregor. We promise you that. Hands on heart. Cross our hearts, hope to die. We would never do something like that to you." "Really?" barked Mr. McGregor. "I do not believe your boys, Mrs. Carson. Your kids are out of control, and I'll be calling the police if this goes on a moment longer. Do you understand?" "Of course, Mr. McGregor," said my mother. "I think you will find my boys are telling the truth. They're not prone to lying, I can promise you that." "I think," said Mr. McGregor, "you do not know your own children, Mrs. Carson. You think they're such nice boys, but the reality is very, very different." The next morning, like clockwork, the police were knocking on our door, and my mother ushered them into our living room with the curlers still in her hair and wearing a bathrobe and a charcoal face mask. "Do come in, officers," she said. "I do apologise for my appearance, but I wasn't actually expecting company." "We are sorry to intrude at such an early hour of the morning," said the officer. "I'm here to speak with your two sons, as serious allegations have been made against them that are very grave indeed, as they concern an elderly man. Your next-door neighbour, apparently. Mr. McGregor, I believe his name is." "That would be right," said my mother. "He is our next-door neighbour." "Boys, come here at once," called my mother, looking exasperated. "The police need to speak to you about Mr. McGregor." My brother and I looked at each other in utter horror, hardly daring to believe that the old man had lived up to his promises and called the police out on us. As far as I was concerned, he was an obnoxious, vindictive, cranky old man that was so determined to make all kinds of wild allegations against us, just to make us pay for daring to take back our confiscated property. My brother and I shook hands with the officers politely and sat down on the opposite sofa, listening to what they had to say. "We have received a complaint against you from your next-door neighbour," said the sergeant, looking at us with a grave expression on his face. "He has filed a public nuisance, vandalism and noise report against the two of you. He is claiming that you're trying to terrorise him at night by throwing stones at his house, banging the sides of his house, smacking them very violently, and staring at him through the window while wearing a gorilla costume." "It's all a lie," I exclaimed. "We do not like Mr. McGregor, sir. He's very horrible, but we wouldn't go to extreme lengths to scare him like that. And, we don't even own a gorilla costume." "Well, he claims to differ on that, boy," said the officer. "He's insistent that you're deliberately trying to terrorise him. You do understand, boys, that this is very serious, and it has got to stop." "Yes, sir," we said, looking at each other earnestly. Why was Mr. McGregor being this vindictive and laying all kinds of false allegations at our door? It wasn't fair. Just because we took our bikes back didn't mean he had to be this spiteful to us, surely. "Are you sure you're not behind all this?" asked my mother, as we watched the police slamming their car doors, getting into their cars and driving off. We could see Mr. McGregor looking as pleased as Punch that we had received a real good telling off by the police. We watched him waving his fists furiously at our house and screaming out, "They'll lock you up! Ha ha ha! And throw away the key! Ha ha!" That night my brother and I decided to take matters into our own hands. We were going to check out Mr. McGregor's property to call him out on all his false allegations against us. We asked a friend of ours, a boy called Conrad, to be a witness so that to the police in case Mr. McGregor filed any more erroneous allegations against us. Conrad, we said, we need you to hide on Mr. McGregor's property all night. We'll be there with you. You need to be there as a witness so that when Mr. McGregor files any more duplicitous reports against us, we can prove that he was lying all along. You need to tell the police on our count that he made everything up because you were watching the house all night with us. Agreed, he said. I'm quite happy to do that. That evening we crept up behind one of Mr. McGregor's very perfectly manicured hedges that was ample enough for all three of us to hide behind. We were armed with flashlights and a supply of cold drinks and snacks to wind away the long hours of boring, monotonous tedium. Luckily it was a full moon, and that together with Mr. McGregor's outdoor light gave us excellent visibility, and we could see both the yard and the house incredibly clearly. Little did we realise that this night was going to live up to be anything but monotonous and boring. It would be at night that would shift our perception of reality forever. Little did we know that. I was growing increasingly bored. It had been a long, frustrating, dull night with no action whatsoever, just as I had anticipated. As I was engaging in those thoughts, out of the shadows appeared a 6-foot monstrous creature who might have been as tall as I was at 14, because at 14 I was very tall for my age, but infinitely more colossal this creature was. This thing could not have been human. There was no way that that was even possible. "What the heck is that?" whispered Conrad in horror. We stared in awe at this majestic creature. Our eyes were as wide as saucers, and our mouths hung to the ground in absolute horror. For a while we were in a state of such baffled amazement as to what this curious creature could actually be. For a moment our feelings of fear were suppressed by feelings of total awe and fascination. This thing, whatever it was, looked exactly like a humanoid ape. Words fail me to describe this creature because it was beyond anything that would fit into the realms of our reality. The creature was covered from head to toe with thick black hair, and every part of this thing rippled with dense, powerful muscle, and it had a very sizable pair of shoulders that supported a large bullet-sized head. The hairless dark face possessed an extensively wrinkled brow ridge, a very large flat nose, and deep-set eyes that appeared to have a menacing red eye-shine. We watched this gargantuan, monstrous creature hurling large rocks at Mr. McGregor's house and crashing the windows so that the glass went flying into the living room. In that moment we saw Mr. McGregor dashing out of his house, insolent with rage, wearing a paisley dressing gown with matching crimson slippers. "I've just had enough of you boys," he said, lunging towards the ape-like humanoid. The Goliath-like creature looked surprised to be challenged by this very pathetic, willowy, puny-looking man, but wasted no time in picking Mr. McGregor up into the air, where he was kicking his legs furiously and screaming, "Put me down! Put me down!" Mr. McGregor suddenly realised that this creature was real, and not one of us kids disguised in a gorilla costume, because his face registered extreme terror. The creature was dangling Mr. McGregor in his one arm, almost like holding a mouse by its tail. It looked exactly like that, and Mr. McGregor kept shouting, "Please, no! No, no!" As Mr. McGregor continued to scream, the creature dropped the man on the grass and lifted him up another time, dangling him precariously from his hands, and it looked like he was going to throw Mr. McGregor against the wall of his house, which I knew could be potentially fatal. In that moment, I knew things looked extremely precarious for the poor, insolent man, and I knew that his life literally hung in the balance if we didn't intervene at once. "Scream at the top of your lungs," I ordered Conrad and my brother. Together we all made the most gut-wrenching, loud screams, and that was enough to get the creature to put down Mr. McGregor. The creature looked up in surprise to hear such a loud, raucous commotion, and he literally just glided away through the forests that flanked Mr. McGregor's home. The creature sped off like greased lightning on his agile legs, and he was literally gone, vanishing into the thick, dense undergrowth. "Are you all right, Mr. McGregor?" I asked, coming out of the hiding place to try and help the shaking old man, who was trembling with terror. "Leave me alone, boys," he screamed. "Out of here, before I call the police on you." "Look what you've made me do," he barked. "I very nearly broke my ankle." He started, wobbling his legs, trying to get up. "I think, Mr. McGregor, if it hadn't been for us, you would have possibly lost your life, let alone break your ankle." "I do not know what you kids are talking about. Now go at once," he ordered. Even though we'd saved the old man's life from the hairy humanoid, there was absolutely no pleasing Mr. McGregor. It seems once insolent and miserable, always insolent and miserable. There's just no metamorphosis of character as far as human beings are concerned, and maybe for some animals too. Maybe once you're insolent, maybe that you're always insolent, and that's just the way it has to be. The very next day, Mr. McGregor put his house on the market and was never seen again in our small town. But I did often wonder what he had done to upset that hairy humanoid, but I guess I'll never know the answer to that question. As for the curious question as to what this creature actually was, I found out years later that we had encountered a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, Yeti or hairy man. It would seem that small towns can never get rid of the decrepit, cantankerous old men, because, believe it or not, as if on cue, Mr. McGregor's home was bought by an equally as petulant man known as Mr. Maloney, and he also created absolute havoc in our young lives. But that is a whole nother story, for another time perhaps. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Andre, and my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 12 years old at the time, and it was in the summer of 1954. I went to stay at my grandmother's home in the Pacific Northwest, where she lived in a tiny cabin in a very remote area of natural wilderness. Her beautiful country cabin was literally tucked away in the middle of the woods, in a tiny open clearing, and it was just literally surrounded by the most tall, majestic, regal-looking trees, such as Douglas fir, grand firs, red cedars and pines that were literally everywhere you looked. There was also a little pebbly, beautiful stream only yards away from the cabin that meandered through the woods and was a favourite spot for me to just sit and pontificate, as well as throw pebbles and play all kinds of outdoor games with myself, as well as sometimes trying my hand at a bit of fishing. It was a perfect location for the whitetail and mule deer to congregate to drink, and believe me, I enjoyed watching the wildlife, and one or two occasions I did actually get to see a black bear, which was very thrilling. The first time I met my grandmother, I was afraid of her, because everything about her was exceedingly peculiar, and she did not conform to traditional stereotypes of how an adult should look or behave, least of all a grandmother. Everything about her was peculiar and strange. She was a small, willowy woman who wore dark navy clothes with white pearls all the time. Everything in her wardrobe was navy. She would wear her grey hair loose so that it flowed over her shoulders in a wild mass of out-of-control curls. Her small face was very heavily wrinkled and her arctic blue eyes were both warm and friendly, but at the same time very sharp and curious, reminding me so much of a hawk because she was so incredibly observant. She would notice things about people that you would never otherwise observe. She would look at you, and by the colour of your skin and the feel of your pulse, she could pretty much tell you what was wrong with your health, and she was always on the money every single time. People came to her from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana and Wyoming, and some even came from as far afield as southeast Alaska. This was when modern medicine had failed them miserably, and they came to her as a last resort. My grandmother never charged for her services because she believed her gift was God-given and needed to be given freely back and generously without ever accepting any kind of repayment. My grandmother helped heal people from all kinds of illnesses, and she had a huge success rate. She would always say that all she was doing was strengthening the immune system to help the body to naturally self-heal. But she also believed that every single illness was connected to an emotion, like the liver was connected to anger, the kidneys to fear, and the heart with anxiety, depression, and deep sadness. She would tell me that all negative thoughts had a vibration, and every emotion was much more toxic to our body and much more deadly and poisonous than any food we eat. I was to learn that these negative emotions accumulate in the tissues of our bodies, and unless they're purged out by a change of mindset and thinking, they can become very serious disease within our own bodies. In the local town, she was known as the crazy wild woman, so people always went to her in secret, not only for her health treatments, but also for the great advice that she gave in areas of their life that usually lacked direction. I remember that one man came to see my grandmother, who was simply terrified of asking a woman on a date, because he was much more painfully shy than other men and was terrified of rejection. And that fear just completely consumed his life. My grandmother knew immediately when she saw him that he lacked courage, and so she gave him a necklace of eagle's feathers to wear under his shirt, and a potion containing wild garlic, ginseng, winter, jasmine, rosemary, basil, and some other wild herbs. He was to take a tincture of these 3 drops on his tongue 5 times a day, and literally within a month this man was engaged, and a year later he was happily married and never ever looked back again. I remember my grandmother saying that the energy and life force of an eagle was so powerful and confident, and actually wearing eagle's feathers would raise the man's energy to a higher vibration that would automatically increase his confidence and success. He was to tell my grandmother later that wearing the eagle's feathers had transformed his life and made his confidence literally soar. I remember one day a man came to visit my grandmother for thanking her for curing his liver disease that he thought he could never ever recover from. He had been told by his doctors and specialists that there was no reversal to his advanced cirrhosis of the liver. But my grandmother gave him some herbs to take and insisted that he did everything he could to examine the anger in his life. You must remove it, she told him, and pull it out by the roots in order to detoxify yourself. You have to change your thinking and your attitude, and you have to be honest with yourself about what's going on in your life emotionally. He was cynical, but he did what my grandmother had said, and apparently the doctors were absolutely flabbergasted because his liver regenerated thoroughly, and even the scarring just completely vanished, which is a miracle in itself because every scarred liver does not normally heal. The man told my grandmother that once he changed his thoughts and got rid of his negative thinking and envy, he began to get healthy and happy. My grandmother's house looked like a witch's tavern. I know of no other way to describe it. It was like an Aladdin's cave full of the most fascinating treasures from all over the well as fastidiously labelled bottles of phials and tinctures of different potions and lotions. If you walked into her house, you would possibly spend hours just looking at her bottles and reading some of the most peculiar ingredients that could be found in them, and that was fascinating, believe me. One day when I was staying at my grandmother's cabin, I opened the cabin door to find a strange hairy bundle lying on the front doorstep. It was curled up loosely in a deerskin, and I realised it was a baby of some kind, but it was barely breathing, and it was in a fetal position. It looked almost human-like, but it was covered in hair. I knew at once whatever this strange thing was, it was definitely dying. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to realise that. I rushed into the house as quickly as I could and gave my grandmother the tiny little creature. I was terrified that it was going to fade away before my very eyes, as the creature appeared to have a bluish tinge to the skin. My grandmother felt the faint pulse of the baby and the dull heartbeat, and she looked very concerned. "It's dying," she said. "The baby is barely breathing. We've not got a moment to lose, otherwise we are going to lose it. We need to increase the circulation and oxygenate the body at once." I watched my grandmother shaving off all the creature's body hair. When she did this, she looked almost like a human, except its head shape was very cone-shaped, and the face was a great deal longer than a human's baby's would invariably be, and the eyes were very deep set, with very pronounced eyelids and thick lashes. "What kind of a baby is it?" I asked my grandmother. She looked at me and smiled. "He's a woodlander," she said. Isn't he absolutely adorable?" I watched my grandmother cover the baby with a blue lotion that contained chamomile, lavender, peppermint and eucalyptus extractions that smelt very much like camphor, She massaged these potions into the baby's body, tapping the creature's skin very, very quickly, especially around the chest area, and then she patted the creature's back quite hard. She spoke words of healing over the baby's body. The baby started to cough and splutter, and then it began to breathe, and I was so happy I was almost dancing up and down for joy and crying out, "It's going to live! It's going to live!" My grandmother smiled at my exuberant enthusiasm. "Would you like to return the baby to its mother?" she asked me. "Oh, yes," I said. "Where does she live?" My grandmother told me to follow the stream until I came to a bended sapling shaped into an arch, and that would tell me that I was in the right location. I was then to look for a very large oak tree stump close by this arched sapling, and I needed to check if there were any stones that were on the stump. If there were 3 stones on the stump, it would mean that the woodlanders were in the area. I was then to use the largest stone on the stump to bang the tree 3 times, and then I was to wait for 3 loud wood knocks in return, and then I was just asked to wait. So that's exactly what I did. It seemed very odd to me that I had to go through this strange protocol for these woodland people, but as a 12-year-old boy, it was rather exciting to me, rather reminding me of a secret code. I realized when I tapped the wood stump with a stone that it made a very particular sound that would be as recognizable to the creatures as a distinctive telephone ringtone might be to us. So in fact the sound was very significant to the creatures. I suddenly heard the 3 tree knocks in the wood that were very distinguishable and were evidently a response to the knocks I'd just made. I stood there waiting for the mother to arrive, and I got the shock of my life when I actually saw her. She was not what I was expecting to see. I was about to encounter a giant humanoid ape, but this is what this strange creature appeared to me. She was very colossal in size, and she towered over me at a substantial height of 9 feet tall, and she could have easily been 800 pounds and 5 feet in width, and that's no exaggeration. In other words, she was gargantuan. There is no other word to describe her. And she was covered in slightly matted dark chestnut hair that gleamed in the sun. Every part of her body rippled with muscle, and even her firm, pronounced feminine breasts were exceedingly toned. The face was bullet-shaped with a very distinctive, slightly wrinkled brow ridge, a very wide, flat nose, and a pair of deep-set, brown, lively-looking eyes. Initially, the creature looked concerned as she regarded me warily holding her baby in the deerskin. I realized suddenly that she might think it was dead, so I lifted up the baby's arm so that she could see that the tiny arm was actually moving. When the mother saw the baby's hands wiggling naturally on their own, she let out the most delighted squeak and rushed boldly towards me, taking the baby from me and gently cradling it in her long arms, with a rapturous look of delight on her face. She let out a loud whistle, and then very suddenly trees were moving, branches were shaking, and the ground was thundering, as creatures seemed to emerge from everywhere, from the high canopy of trees and from the thick undergrowth. Before I knew it, I was surrounded by several of these majestic, lofty creatures, all towering over me like marvellously magnificent forest giants, and I felt so small and inconspicuous by contrast. The creatures were chattering among themselves so excitedly, and what could only be described as a monkey language, and the little baby, bundled in the animal skin, was literally being handled from one woodlander to another, as every creature was making sure that the baby was indeed alive. It was like watching children together playing pass the parcel, and every time a woodlander got hold of the baby, they would let out a shrill whistle, as if to say, "It's really alive!" The enraptured energy created by these curious creatures was literally electrifying. The mother then possessively took her baby and started to nurse it, and it suckled her breast hungrily for several long minutes. She then pulled back the animal skin and looked startled to observe that the baby had no hair on its body anymore, and she made a strange chattering sound, and once again the baby was passed around for every woodlander, as they all examined the smooth skin with their sausage-like fingers, with intrigued and puzzled looks on their expressive faces. I noticed a lot of "ah" sounds being made among the creatures as they looked at each other with an expression that can only be articulated as "wow." Then the mother smelt the baby, and she made a chattering sound, and once again the baby was passed from one woodlander to another as they all proceeded to smell the baby like we might sniff or smell a bar of soap or perfume. And once again there was a long chorus of ahs going on among all the creatures. The mother looked at me, and she nodded as if she was saying, "Thank you so very much." And then she took her baby and handed it to me for a moment, and as if she was getting me to say goodbye to it. And then she took my hand and put something in my hand, closing my fingers over what felt like a stone. I then walked away back to my grandmother's cabin, dying to see what the creature had actually given me. When I got back to my grandmother's cabin, I examined the stone closely that I had been given. It was not an ordinary pebble, but was an amethyst, and all these years later I have got that marvellous stone still in my possession. A day or so after my grandmother had treated the baby, there was a deer skin left outside her door, filled with morel mushrooms, some salmon, steelhead, rainbow trout, and a large turkey, as well as some wild berries and ginseng. I was delighted that the woodlanders had gifted us so generously. A week or so later I was trying my hand at some fishing and simply failing to catch anything, and I was sitting on the side of the stream when out of nowhere a woodlander appeared and came sliding down a nearby tree like a fireman coming down a pole, and he darted towards the stream, and before I knew it he had jumped into the water, and he managed to catch a few fish for me with a piece of timber he had sharpened at the edges to resemble a pointed arrow. He threw the fishes towards me, where they landed beside my feet. I was just about to thank the creature, but he just disappeared into the forest, and I never saw him again. My grandmother sadly died in 1975, and I was given her urn of ashes to scatter on the stream, on the land where she had once lived, that now was in the possession of a large landowner. I had to ask him for special permission to scatter the ashes there. I was to discover that my grandmother's cabin had been torn down and the woods were still very much intact, but in the place where her house was once located stood a lovely medium-sized oak tree that was growing by the day, and it was surrounded with lots and lots of rocks that appeared to look like some kind of memorial to my grandmother. When I asked the new landowner about the tree and the rocks, he said that he did not know how the tree and the rocks had got there, and it was an enigma to him. I am convinced that the memorial for my grandmother had been placed there by the woodlanders. It was only in 2009, I think it was, that I was to discover that these woodlanders were in fact Sasquatches or Bigfoot, and I realise now how privileged I was to have such a marvellous encounter with such incredible creatures, which I now know to be Bigfoots. Well, I have to say that was the most fabulous story. I'm sure all of you are going to agree with that. I just love the fact that every organ in our body is connected to an emotion. And I really believe that that is actually true, because I know someone who had liver disease that was very, very advanced. And this individual was a very jealous person, always envious of everybody. And I truly think that that might have had something to do with his condition. I could, of course, be incredibly wrong. But anyway, what a fascinating story. And I love the fact that this grandmother just treated people with so many conditions and had such an enormous success rate. So what an amazing story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1989 when I was living in rural Tennessee with my husband Barry. We lived in a stunningly picturesque wooden log cabin on a hilly elevation that was flanked on every side with areas of emerald green forest that literally went back for hundreds of miles. In the distance you could see the high-rise mountains that towered majestically against the pale blue firmament. We lived well off the beaten track, with our nearest neighbours literally miles away. And despite the remoteness, I loved the solitude of my life. Quite literally, the deer and the mountain lions were my real neighbours, and I loved it that way. I had a huge passion and respect for nature, and I would spend all my spare time hiking and exploring the gorgeous countryside. I would also make regular trips to a beautiful pebbly stream that travailed through one of our wild areas of natural woodland, and there I would sit with my easel and my oils paints, surveying the beautiful scenery and painting magnificent scenes of nature. During the day, my husband worked for a wealthy farmer in the local area, helping him with all kinds of jobs around his farm, and he did pay handsomely, as my husband was competent at all his outdoor jobs and exceedingly good with his hands. One day I got a dramatic telephone call from my sister Sylvia, who had suddenly fallen off her horse and broken a leg and a couple of ribs in a riding accident. Apparently the horse had become freaked out about a strange clanging sound it had heard, and subsequently it bucked her off his back, where her foot became entrenched in the syrup, and she had been dragged around the large meadow. She got off lightly, it would seem, in the circumstances, with only a few injuries, such as broken ribs. Let me assure you that a broken rib can be a massive setback for anyone, as pain can be relentless. She wondered in the circumstances if I wouldn't mind taking care of my 4.5-year-old niece, just for a few days, she assured me. It would appear that her usually competent au pair, who minded her kid, had run off with a boyfriend to Hawaii for a sunny break. Although I agreed to help, I did warn her that I wasn't confident of my skills as a babysitter, as I had no experience with children whatsoever, and I could not guarantee doing a great job. "Oh, it'll be a doddle," she assured me. "Kids aren't complicated. I'll get Mark," that was her husband, "to drop her off along with some of her toys, and she'll be good to go, I promise you that." My sister made it all sound terribly easy, but when Mark did drop off my 4.5-year-old niece at our countryside home, I found that she wasn't easy to manage at all. On the contrary, she was an absolute handful of unabated energy, and was always wandering off and getting easily distracted. I tried to occupy her with everything I could, like finger painting and moulding clay and even Lego blocks, but she pretty much became jaded and disinterested in everything that I presented her with. I have to admit that I became increasingly exasperated by my niece's constant need for stimulation. I suddenly developed a huge admiration for every single mother out there, and realized in horror that raising a kid has got to be the most laborious, arduous, and challenging job in the entire world, especially when there are kids that are Kayla's age to deal with. It was on a Friday morning when my niece was playing with her plastic telephone that I'd actually brought her from a toy shop, that luckily seemed to be holding her attention for longer than most of her toys had. She was talking on the fake phone, enjoying her little adult-like conversation. I heard her say, "You must smack him for being a very naughty boy." I smiled to myself and then went racing into the kitchen. I had forgotten to put the bread on timer, and I could smell the burnt charcoal all over the house. Everything was smoking, and my eyes were watering from the smoky vapours. I opened all the windows of the house to air the place. I could see my niece standing on the settee in the living area, with her back facing towards me. She was making strange, contorted faces at the window, and chuckling all the time. I was so pleased to see that finally she was entertaining herself. She was talking, giggling, and chuckling all the time. I smiled gratefully to myself. I had heard of kids having invisible friends before, and this clearly was one of those scenarios, I thought. That evening I prepared my niece fish fingers and potato chips, served with tomato sauce. She was playing with her food and dunking the fish finger into the tomato sauce and tucking it into her mouth with great gusto, staining the edges of her mouth with red stains. "Do you think Tommy would like fish fingers?" she asked me. "I'm sure he would," I said, assuming that Tommy was her invisible friend. "Then I'll save some for him," she said, putting a fish finger into her napkin and folding it up. I decided to overlook the fish finger and napkin incident, as clearly her invisible friend felt very real to her, and I knew if I kept the charade up, then maybe my niece would not be so demanding on me, as selfish as that does sound. I don't mind admitting to you that taking care of little Kyla was wearing me to the ground, and I was feeling physically drained and utterly exhausted. I tucked little Kayla up in her Snoopy-covered duvet with a little brown teddy bear tucked in her arms, and I read her a bedtime story about Water, the clever butterfly. With relief, I watched her falling off to deep sleep, but that was very short-lived when during the night I was awoken to strange knocking sounds all over the house that sounded like someone was hitting the walls, which was profoundly odd. I could hear delightful squeals of laughter coming from Kayla's room, and I saw to my horror that she was jumping up and down on her bed in her Snoopy pyjamas, looking outside her window, saying, "Tommy is here! Tommy is here!" She appeared to be absolutely delighted. "I want to go outside to see Tommy," she said. "I want to play with him right now." Foolishly, I forgot about the strange knocks, and I tucked Kyla into bed, reassuring her that Tommy needed a good night's sleep, otherwise he would be very tired in the morning and would not want to play with her. At this, Kyla did listen, and she seemed satisfied, and insisted on putting her fish finger on the outside window mantle for little Tommy to get later, when he finally got hungry. I'm ashamed to say that my ignorance with children transcends to massive heights, relegating me to the very high rank of the worst possible babysitter in the entire world. I assure you that there were no intuitive alarm bells ringing in my head at this strange gesture of kindness from Kyla that bordered on the peculiar. I just thought it was normal that she was putting a fish finger out on the mantle. It was really bizarre that I should even think that. The following morning I was cleaning my rustic home that looked like a mini tornado had vandalised the entire living room, that was literally littered with Lego blocks, kids' drawings, baby dolls and tiny dolls' dresses that were literally scattered over every available surface. I picked up Kayla's toys, replacing them in a large cardboard box marked toys, and then I plumped up the cushions to gain some kind of respect on the sofas, and started hoovering the carpet. Kayla was playing on her little tricycle yards away from me on the outer porch. I could hear the bicycle wheels squeaking on the wooden decking. Kayla was talking excitedly to her invisible friend, and I could hear her high-pitched voice squealing out in utter delight. "I've got a telephone! I can talk to you on my phone! I can call you!" I was laughing to myself. She was doing a great job in entertaining herself, I thought. And then I suddenly heard it, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was a strange chattering sound, unlike anything I've ever heard before, but it did have a monkey-like tone to it. It was very odd. For a moment I just froze to the spot, hardly daring to believe what I'd just heard. I tightened my hand on the hoover. Surely I was mistaken. Then I heard the chattering sound again. I switched off the droning sound of the hoover immediately and rushed over to the glass sliding doors to see who Kayla was actually talking to, and I could hardly believe what my eyes were witnessing. Kayla was talking to a little hairy ape-like humanoid that was about 3 feet tall and covered with red-brown hair all over its body, apart from its hazelnut-coloured face that was completely hairless. The creature had a bullet-shaped head, very distinctive prominent brow ridge, a wide flat nose, and very deep-set, lively yellow-brown eyes that did seem to sparkle brightly. Its demeanour was very excitable, and it seemed to be really revelling and enjoying Kayla's company. It wore an exuberant expression on its leathery brown face, which was animated, and his mouth was curled back to show off a glistening set of pearl-white teeth that appeared to be smiling. For a second I just froze to the spot, incapacitated by a stupefied horror rather than by fear. What was this thing, I wondered? I'd never seen a creature like this before. Should I be concerned? I hurriedly dashed through the sliding doors and grabbed Kayla off her little tricycle, lifting her into my arms quickly and bringing her indoors as fast as I could, bolting the doors behind me. What else was I supposed to do? Kayla was not amused by my actions, and she had a childlike tantrum and hissy fit. "I want to play with Tommy! I want to play with Tommy! I want to play with Tommy! I want to play with Tommy!" she said, stamping her tiny little feet in a gesture of defiant insubordination. "I want to play with Tommy! Why aren't you letting me play with Tommy?" Ignoring my niece, I went over to the glass sliding door, and staring out of the sheer glass panel, I found myself looking directly into the eyes of the little ape-like humanoid, who was staring back at us with a look of curious intrigue all over his face. "Go away," I said. "Go away, creature! Go away! Go away!" The creature tried to make gestures. I tried to make gestures for the creature to leave, but the creature chattered so excitedly, and it began to mimic my gestures and impersonated my serious facial expressions, clearly believing that this was all a terribly exciting game. I remember grabbing a large bunch of bananas, because I knew monkeys liked bananas, and that was my first reaction, and I threw them out of the window, falsely believing that the little humanoid would just dash off with them and hopefully run back into the forests where he must have come from, I thought. But the creature grabbed the bananas and started to eat them on the wooden deck, cramming them into his mouth, including the skins, and he made some very satisfied, appreciative grunts. Mmm, mmm, mmm. I could hear a whistling sound from the valley, and I saw this colossal creature literally gliding towards our cabin, and her movements were seamless, agile, and flawless, and she bounded over the wooden railing with the agility of a domestic cat. She bolted towards her little youngling with a furious look written on her face. She looked like a mother who was exasperated with her naughty child, and she was standing on our wooden deck, chattering away to the creature in a high-pitched voice. I could sense that she was reprimanding the youngling and giving him a huge telling off, and he appeared to be hanging his little head in shame, looking incredibly despondent. The mother was utterly magnificent. I know of no other words to describe her, because she towered at 9 feet tall and weighed at least 800 pounds, and she was majestic, lofty, powerful, and imposing. She was covered from head to toe with long red-brown hair that glistened magnificently in the beams and the shafts of sunlight. Her body was dense with sinewy, muscular definition, and in worldly terms she was simply ripped, but she did appear to have a pair of firm breasts and a very evident maternal demeanour. Her long primate-like arms lifted up the little humanoid, where its legs clasped loosely around her slender hips. Suddenly she looked up as she sensed me watching her, with a look of sheer astonished enchantment on my face. For a moment our eyes just locked together, and it was like we connected, and I almost sensed that she was apologising for her youngling's behaviour. Her beautiful yellow-brown eyes registered such sharp intelligence, and I watched her hopping over the wooden banisters and gliding into the woods seamlessly. She only glanced back once in my direction, very briefly, as if she was saying goodbye. I knew very suddenly that the little youngling would not be troubling us any more. It was such a very powerful, intuitive feeling that came over me like a very instinctive revelation. My little niece was very upset and angry with me. She was upset that little Tommy was not there to play with her, and she persistently complained, "I want Tommy to play with me! I want Tommy to play with me! You made him go away! Why did you make him go?" I asked her why she called the creature Tommy. "'Cause he told me," she said. "How could he tell you if he doesn't speak our language?" I asked her. "'Cause he speaks into your head, silly." It was then that I was convinced that these creatures have some kind of clear telepathic ability, because I had literally sensed the mother apology, an assurance to me that had appeared like crystal clear words in my mind. She told me in my mind that Tommy would not be bothering us again, that she would make sure of that. Believe me, she fulfilled her promises, because I never saw those creatures again, much to my bitter disappointment. After these strange set of circumstances that had come to pass in my life, I developed a particular longing to encounter the creatures again, which I have learnt is very common among observers of these creatures, many who might spend their entire lifetime seeking out another encounter with the elusive, hairy humanoid. After Kyla returned home, everything around my home returned to normal. I looked out for those phenomenal creatures, but sadly I never ever saw them again. But I do know for sure that these marvellous creatures are out there, roaming the forests of North America. And that is one thing I know for certain. Bear in mind that this was in the early 80s, so when I did tell my husband what I'd seen, he was convinced I'd seen something else, like a hairy vagrant living in the woods, or a bear. I did tell him that the vagrant would clearly have had to have a major problem with excessive body hair, if that had been the case, but my husband remained convinced that it had in fact been a man that I had seen. I remember reconciling myself that there was no way I could convince anyone in what I'd seen, because people would never believe my story, and I just had to live with that. It was only a decade or so later that I learnt the creatures that I'd seen were known as Sasquatches or Bigfoots. I was never once frightened by the creatures, but I assure you it was only because the ones I encountered were so warm, human-like and incredibly friendly. I am, however, in absolutely no doubt that should the creature have been aggressive towards me, that would have been a very terrifying experience, because I want to tell you they are apex predators without a doubt, and they do command great respect. Like human beings, I imagine they come in all shapes, sizes, colours and personalities. Kyla has now grown up into a beautiful young woman, but has no recollection of her encounter with the hairy humanoid that she encountered when she was 4.5 years old, which is such a pity. However, if you ask her today if she believes in the mystery elusive creature known as Bigfoot, she certainly does believe he's real. And I think that she feels this way because somewhere in the back of her mind, she knows that he is. And that is my story. Tonight's story is very lovely because it's all about how this incredible box that came all the way from ancient Egypt and was cleaned up to be a stunning, beautiful piece of a natural artifact, ended up in the hands of a very appreciative Bigfoot. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Brian, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the summer of 2015, when I was a 28-year-old single man venturing out on a solo camping trip to the stunning Blue Ridge Mountains for a well-deserved summer break. I currently reside in the Old Town Chicago area, and I practice as a divorce and family lawyer, dealing with all the challenging legal disputes and marital cases, collaborative law, child dispute issues, and the list goes on and on. As you can imagine, my job can be an emotional roller coaster, although I try not to get involved emotionally with my clients, and it can leave behind an indelible thumbprint in your life that can tarnish your view of humanity due to the way that some people treat each other. I often have to remind my client that they did once love their partner, and that doesn't always go down too well. Sometimes one of the best stress relievers for me is going to garage sales or antique shows. I relish looking out for unusual antiques and haggling a good bargain for myself, which is part of the pleasurable gratification I gain from this kind of recreational activity. I have always been beguiled by unusual things, especially those things that have an interesting history behind them, and I often frequent antique roadshows in the hope of stumbling across individual, unique, unusual, and extraordinary items. My house in Chicago is quite literally a stunning Aladdin's cave of curious things from around the world, from interesting tapestry items of furniture, ceramic pots, statues, old books, and all kinds of odds and ends that I have collected since I was very young. One day I heard about a garage sale about 2 hours away from where I lived. Word around town was that this elderly man was going to sell some of his extraordinary antique collectibles, as he was actually moving into a retirement home and wanted to sell off some of his stuff, to people that would actually appreciate it. As you can imagine, there are always your usual regulars that you see at garage sales, but on this occasion I noticed some very serious collectors among the potential buyers who I knew of very well, and they had beady eyes on some of the items that this guy was selling, and I noticed that they were examining them very closely on the large tables that cluttered the yard, and by their expressions there were certainly some items worth buying. I cannot begin to describe the flurry of excitement I feel when I arrive at a yard sale for the first time that has the possibility of being a goldmine of potential treasures. Physically, I was literally quaking with animated enthusiasm, as I was so terrified that one of those collectors might get to the real gem before I did. That is always the worry. The question is where to look first. I could see some renowned, well-known collectors holding up ornate items, examining them closely, and then striking deals with the old man as quickly as they could. Then there was that all-too-familiar competitive eagerness bubbling up and burning inside me with an impulsive, exuberant enthusiasm to find the priceless treasure that lay buried among all the items on display. Like a kid in a candy store, overwhelmed by so many choices, I started examining some interesting smaller items on the tables on the far left-hand side of the yard, strategically located under a large oak tree with colossal branches that provided a perfect shady canopy. The sweltering 90-degree temperatures of that day soared to ridiculous extremes, causing the buyers to look hot, flustered, but no less determined to strike a bargain as much as I was. I truly felt like a prize vulture among many hungry scavengers, with my eagle eyes focused relentlessly on the many different carcasses, and I was wondering which one to devour first. In this case, I was determined that I would be leaving with the priceless artifact. With quick hands, I lifted and studied and inspected every item, observing them very briefly and working very quickly, and replacing them to look at something else. Then I saw it, and my heart started to race with such excitement. It was a small little ornate treasure box, surrounded by the most gorgeous little gemstones that I'd ever seen. And when you opened the box, it played a stunning musical tune. I knew in that instant that I just had to have it, and nothing was going to stop me. Just as I was about to grab the item, a feminine hand was also on the box, trying to pull it away from me. I remember locking eyes with the stranger, and we became like two predators, ready to fight for our lives to get to the prize. It was a woman, and her big brown hawk-like eyes challenged me with a very vicious, hostile, "How dare you" energy. And then she pulled out the lady's first card, as if in some way being a woman had sealed the deal for her, and I was expected to surrender the box to her, and that was not going to happen. Today was not the day for me to be a gentleman, that I can assure you. "Not so fast, lady," I said. I got to the box first. The old man stepped forward. "Well, this is nothing that a little haggling will not resolve. Whoever gives me the best price gets the box. I think that's fair enough, don't you?" he said. "I agree," I said. "That's fair enough. But may I ask you something? Where on earth did you get this glorious treasure? It is so unique. I've never seen anything so marvellous." "It's from ancient Egypt," he said. "It was found in a cave near the Valley of the Kings, and it was discovered covered in loads of mud a very long time ago. My grandfather brought it, along with a few ceramic bits and pieces from a street peddler in Egypt. He did check, of course, with the Cairo Museum and go through the usual protocol that he could legally bring it back to America. And they dismissed it as an item of very little historic relevance. It's not really valuable, but it's a beauty, even if I say so myself. My grandfather cleaned it up, and then he turned it into this musical box. I do have to warn you, though, that my grandfather believed the box was cursed, because he claimed strange things happened after he got it. So he buried it away in our attic, and I only retrieved it the other day. I want to sell it because I don't need any bad luck in my life. I've had enough problems already with my rheumatoid arthritis, and I certainly don't need any more. Are there any offers now that I've told you that this could potentially be cursed?" He was expecting. As a hardened skeptic, I was not superstitious, so suggesting that the box held a curse did not alter my desire to possess it in any way. On the contrary, such an extraordinary disclosure only reinforced my keenness to own such a gem, because I loved anything with a significance behind it. It would seem that the woman was not concerned by the possible curse either, so it would seem that we both had a dispute on our hands that needed to be resolved with some very serious haggling. So there you are. Things got very heated, with a lot of bartering, but in the end I walked away triumphant, hardly daring to believe my luck, but also how much money I'd actually spent on the box. It was way more than I would normally choose to spend, and a lot more than it was probably worth. The woman walked away hissing at me like a cobra snake, and as I got to my Jeep, there she was keying my car with her car keys. And then writing on my windscreen, "I will get you," in pink lipstick. "Lady," I cried, "you can't screw with my car like that. You need to pay for the damages." "Stuff you," she said, giving me a hostile glare and stomping off with a furious, enraged look on her face. "I'll get that box," she shouted at me, "one way or another. You mark my words." Fast forward a couple of days, and this strange box had a curious, bewitching hold over me, almost as ominous as the ring that had a hold over Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. I quite literally took it everywhere I went, because I was so troubled by the worrying possibility that that vicious woman would break into my house and steal it from me. I had met women like her before, with an unrepentant, fiery determination to get whatever they wanted at any cost, even if it meant breaking or flouting the law. I had been planning a camping trip with my best friend, Ethan, for over 6 months now, and the day before we were due to go on our trip, he had a nasty fall at work and subsequently shattered and broke his ankle, meaning that I was left with 2 choices. 1, I was either going to have to go solo, or 2, not go at all. In truth, the idea of a solo camping trip sounded rather alluring to me. It would be a true adventure, I thought, and I would be able to dictate my own schedule, and that was a nice idea. I had some books I wanted to read, and it would do me good to enjoy some sweet mountain fresh air, stunningly beautiful views, and some physical challenges. So I convinced myself that a solo trip was a great advantage for me, with many prospective health benefits. I was determined to camp and hike off the beaten track, which on reflection is not the best idea for a solo camper. But I wanted a physical challenge, and that is what I did. So armed with my backpack and all the essentials I would need for a few days, I proceeded on my way. Tucked away in my backpack was my ornate Egyptian box I had recently purchased that I had decided to bring on my trip, because try as I might, I was powerless to leave it behind. It was my first day of hiking, and I was feeling absolutely exhilarated. I was literally surrounded by blue misty mountains that towered majestically into the blue-grey firmament. Then there were the huge rocky outcrops of cascading waterfalls descending from great heights with their magnificent white bubbly foam. There were emerald green rolling hills, enchanting gorges banked with pretty wild flowers, vast areas of natural wilderness, wildlife and plenty of forests. It really was every hiker's dream, and I was in the thick of it all, blissfully enjoying the shafts of warm sunlight on my face and the physical exertion of my journey, which was both exhilarating and challenging. What was there not to like on this stupendous, exciting adventure? I wondered privately to myself. The first night was pretty unremarkable, and after the long, exhausting physical exertion of the first day of a strenuous hike, I pretty much just prepared a fire pit, ate a speedy dinner, and was out like a light that night. But it was on the following night that strange things began to happen that were out of my realm of understanding. I had found a beautiful clearing on a high elevation to pitch my tent, besides a beautiful rocky stream, which was an ideal spot to gather my water for boiling. Either side of the clearing was flanked with a forest that consisted of towering giants of sugar maple, American beech, white oak, and yellow birch trees. I began to prepare my fire pit, and before long I was hungrily eating a freeze-dried meal of chicken stew and rice, while I admired the beautiful golden sunset smouldering over the escarpment in pretty yellows, oranges, and pinks. Before long, darkness fell over the valley like a dark, sinister blanket, although the light of the full moon and pretty stars did impact a somewhat soft, gentle illumination, which was very comforting over the entire valley. It was in that moment that I sat by the fire, holding my ornate Egyptian box in my hands, examining it very, very closely, and running my fingers over the protruding jewelled stones. And then I opened the box to listen to the pretty mellow tune. It was very uplifting. Suddenly I felt very certain that I was being watched. I was sure I had seen some red eye shine, 8 feet high, coming from the trees, but I couldn't be certain of that. I was second-guessing myself. Then I noticed these strange balls of white light, like orbs dancing through the woodline, and although they were very prepossessing, there was something eerily sinister about them, almost as if these lights hid a deep darkness within their depths. What the heck, I thought to myself in horror. I was the most cynical person you could get, but seeing these strange orbs of light did make me question my own sanity. The light display continued for some time, but it made me feel incredibly crowded, almost like there were hundreds of hostile eyes gazing upon me and fencing me in with a hostile malaise. I put on my headlamp and sat in the tent, trying to distract myself with a book that I'd been meaning to read for a long time and had never got round to it. Before long I had fallen into a deep sleep, and I was awoken to the sound of a strange yelling coming from the woods. In truth, the only way that I can describe it is it truly sounded like a woman was being violently and aggressively assaulted. The sound was so terrifying and gut-wrenching that I sat up very fast, startled, and pondered what I should do. Should I go and check out the sound, or just remain huddled in my tent? The last option seemed so much more preferable, but then that would make me a coward, and supposing there really was a woman hiker out there being savagely attacked by a wild animal, how could I live with myself if I did nothing to help? Then I heard the scream again, and it was so piercing and very feminine. I simply could not sit back a moment longer, even though being a hero held absolutely no desire for me whatsoever. So armed with my rifle and wearing my headlamp, I ventured out into the dusky night, feeling ever so slightly anxious as to what I just might encounter. I heard the sound again, and it sounded like someone was being gutted. It was horrifying. I literally sprinted into the woods, cocking my rifle and taking cover behind a large tree trunk, checking to see if I could see something. Then I heard a loud crashing sound, and then my heart started to pound very violently in my chest. But to my shock, it was just a white-tailed deer darting through the undergrowth and eyeing me warily as it scurried away. I sighed in relief as I watched it vanish into the shadows. The forest seemed so eerily quiet, and the shrill feminine screams had all but receded. They had lured me into the forest, so that I had left my tent. It was so deathly quiet, and the stillness was so awful that I could actually hear my own breathing. There were no sounds of nature that I used to hear at night, like owls, coyotes, or even crickets, which did mean that the forest had taken on a menacing ambience. I had been told once that when it got as quiet as this, it meant a predator was around. I cocked my rifle and ventured towards my camp, and then I saw something moving around in my tent, and whatever it was enormous, because the canvas was vibrating and shaking and moving, almost as if there was a punneling windstorm going on within my tent. Then I saw something hefty on all fours climbing out of the entrance, and at first glance it looked like a massive black bear. That was until it rose up on two hind legs, and I realized that this thing was much more colossal than a bear. I was observing a hairy humanoid giant. This Herculean-sized creature was massive in size, at about 8 foot tall, 900 pounds, and 5 feet wide. The shoulders were absolutely monstrous, unlike anything I've ever seen. My first impression was that a specimen of King Kong had emerged from a book and taken on a physical life form. It looked exactly like a humanoid ape, with long arms, monstrous proportions, a cone-shaped head, and coal-black hair covering the entire body, except for the long face that I could not see clearly in the dim light. I crept up closer to my camp, wondering whether I should shoot at this thing to scare it off. This beast, I could see, was very dangerous, and if things got heated, I might have to kill it. But I did not fancy my chances in taking on such a formidable foe. It was very big. However, all my possessions were in that camp, and I couldn't afford to lose them. Or could I? What on earth was the creature doing, I wondered. Luckily, my tent was very close to a couple of large oak trees, and so I crept ever so quietly forward, taking very care not to be seen and not to make any noises. I ventured as close as I could to my tent so that I could get a good view of what actually was going on with this strange creature. The gargantuan hairy humanoid was literally rifling through my large backpack and scattering all my possessions precariously over the ground. To my horror, he was not alone. I noticed there was another creature with him. Amazingly, it was a female, and she was also monstrously big, but significantly smaller than her male counterpart. I watched them examining all my items, from the metal bowls, pots and fire starters, and freeze-dried food. The male literally tore open my packet of instant oats and poured some of my dried oatmeal porridge onto his tongue and offered some to the female. She poured it into her mouth and chewed the dried contents with very little enthusiasm on her face. I think it tasted like cardboard to her. I can't say I was surprised. They were grunting and making a cacophony of interesting sounds. It was when they came across my ornate musical box that my heart almost missed a beat. "Please no," I begged silently to myself. I wondered whether they were going to damage my Egyptian artifact by throwing it impetuously on the ground, along with all my other possessions like pots and shoes and clothes and fishing tackle and freeze-dried food. The large creature ran his hands across the jewelled stones, and he made some appreciative sounds. Oh, 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 as if he found the box to be very intriguing. There was no doubt that it was captivating the creature's attention, like it had done me. And then when he opened it and the tune started playing, the creature was totally mesmerized, seemingly bewitched and enchanted and beguiled by my unique, priceless treasure. He kept closing and opening my ornate artifact, and the two hairy humanoids became so excited and intrigued by what they were seeing. Woof, woof, woof. Suddenly everything else in my backpack lost its huge appeal, and all my items were liberally scattered across the ground like the wreckage and carnage after a wild party. In awe, they continued to examine my box, chattering away, excited, in strange gibberish to each other, backwards and forwards, in very engaged conversation. I knew instinctively that these creatures were going to take my ornate box. I knew that without a doubt, and I couldn't bear the thought of it. I was behaving just like Gollum. I just couldn't bear it, so recklessly I stepped forward to challenge them. "Put that down! It's mine!" I said, stepping boldly out of the shadows. Bear in mind, I must have been completely bark-raving mad, out of my mind, to simply approach apex predators like this in the very first place. I know of no human being that would be that crazy and would behave so foolishly as I did, because things could have turned very sour very quickly. But I told you that this Egyptian artifact had a very strange, beguiling hold over me, and its spellbinding effects had quite literally suppressed all my fear. The two hairy critters looked up at me in surprise. On reflection, I'm almost certain that my calm boldness and demeanour made my approach almost seem routine, as if I'd encountered hairy monstrous apes frequently in the forest on a regular basis, and it was as natural as breathing to me. Instead, they continued to examine the box, barely noticing me, and playing the musical tune over and over again, looking at each other in appreciative awe. And then they finally looked at me, including me in this stunning discovery, which they wanted to also share with me. I thought as quickly as I could, trying to distract the creatures and divert their attention in some way. How could I get them to lose interest in my wonderful treasure, I wondered. I reached out quickly for my portable gas cooker, and I turned it on, putting a pot of water on it so that the creatures could watch it boil. When they saw the fire spark created by the gas cooker, and their yellow-brown eyes grew as round as saucers in astonishment, and they made a sound that sounded like "ooh, ooh." Much like children that were oohing and aahing about seeing something that was incredibly interesting, they stood over the pot, watching the water boiling, with spirited expressions on their eager faces, making a cacophony of interesting exchanges between each other, and talking to each other in shrill gibberish tones. Once the water had boiled, I made myself a sweet milky tea, and then I drank some out of the mug, and offered some to them to taste, but the big male glugged it down, and then he made a large satisfactory burping sound in his throat. The female looked annoyed with the male, because he had drunk all the tea, and nudged me with the mug as if to say, "I want some too," so I obediently made her a large sweet mug of the steaming tea. She drank the warm liquid quickly, and then made a large satisfactory burp in the back of her throat, and made a huge delighted squeal, almost as if she was appreciative and enjoying her tea-drinking experience. All the while I noticed the large alpha male sausage-sized fingers remained clamped tightly over my treasure box, and I could see he was not going to release his firm hold any time soon. I started offering the creatures prunes and raisins in the hope that the distraction of my delicious treats would subdue their keen interest in my treasure box. Soon a huge chomping session began between the three of us as I joined in, and it was like we were all gathered in a movie theatre together, stuffing our mouths with popcorn while we watched the show, which in this case was my musical box, that the hairy humanoid was relentlessly playing over and over again, because he just could not get enough of it. I started to make hand gestures towards the box, trying to explain that it was in fact mine, but the two creatures started mimicking my gestures and making strange contorted expressions with their long hairless faces, as if we were now engaged in a game of charades. I could not get through to them that this was my box. They curled back their thin dark lips, exposing their glistening white human-like teeth at me in what I certainly believe were open smiles. It was as if they were giggling hysterically at something amusing, and they were swaying their bodies backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. In exasperation, I reached for a tiny little torch I owned, and quickly handed it to the female, pressing the button on and off to show her how the light worked. Once again, a riveted, intrigued expression washed over her keen face, and she proceeded to show the large male her wonderful treasure. He swankily began to show her my jewelled treasure, as if to say, Mine is nicer than yours. I suddenly realized that they thought I had gifted them the male with the box and the female with the torch, which was not my intention at all. I went into my tent to look for something else to show them, but when I came out of the entrance, they had both seemingly vanished. I remember feeling disappointed that they had gone. Their presence had broken the solitude of my strange mountain adventure. In a queer way, the childlike innocence of these intelligent creatures had won me over, but I was still very upset about my jewelled box that I had begrudgingly realized that I would never get back. It was still dusky outside, but the full moon illuminated the horizon, and the cheerful bright silvery stars danced in the firmament. I restoked the flames of my fire pit, as I always love watching the crackling flames, folding, bending, and consuming the wood. I stared into the flames, momentarily hypnotized, as I felt the warm heat burning against my face. I pontificated and reflected about the ape-like humanoids that I had encountered, and reviewed my whole experience with them in my head, like a tape recorder on rewind. What on earth were those creatures, I wondered to myself. I'd never heard of creatures like them before. It was extraordinary that such critters like this, with their uncanny human-like characteristics, were not talked about or discussed in America. Surely I was not alone in my peculiar encounter with these amazing creatures. Then I suddenly sat up in surprise as a memory came rebounding back. I remember watching a program on TV about Bigfoots. Of course, I thought, sitting up startled. These creatures are Bigfoots. I encountered a Bigfoot. I vaguely remember hearing that Bigfoots were incredibly dangerous, volatile, and unpredictable. I considered how I had approached them with a bold confidence, catching them off guard. I believe my fearless energy had diffused any potential predatory reaction from them, and it would seem that I had befriended the creatures rather than made sworn enemies out of them. I began to reflect on the sheer monstrous size of the creatures, and to realize that the alpha male's powerful arms were so powerful and so strong that he could literally have crushed my skull like an egg without a problem, and that was not a very comforting thought, to say the least. I also considered how my fear for the creatures had been quashed because of my ornate jewelled box, and my hankering, longing desire to get it back at all costs, potentially at the foolish risk of losing my very own life. Wow, I thought, stoking up the flames of the fire pit at this horrifying revelation. That silly ornate box could have cost me my life tonight. Maybe it is cursed after all, I thought. I appraised the Lord of the Rings story in my head, and how Gollum had been determined to risk anything for that ring, which he called my precious. It would seem that the jewelled box had some kind of tantalizing hold over me, which was a very bad thing indeed. These artifacts from ancient Egypt may be potential objects of witchcraft, I thought, designed to entice, deceive, and even destroy. And for what, I thought? In the grand scheme of things, it was hardly worth it. Suddenly I heard a movement in the brush that sounded like two hefty rhinos, and then I saw the shadowy dark forms of the Bigfoots approaching me that looked like two huge shadowy figures in the dim light. The female handed me 3 white bass fish that were entwined with a strong grass, and the male presented me with a very large stone, which I was later to discover was a blue quartz. The creatures, after gifting me, both left as suddenly as they came, and I was actually sad to see them go. As they slunk away into the shadows, they moved with incredible agility and grace and a fluidness that was beyond anything I'd ever seen before. And then they were gone. I began to cook the white bass over the fire pit as the golden sun rose over the valley to welcome in a bright new day, along with the musical serenade of the enchantingly pretty dawn chorus of the songbirds. It was an early breakfast for me, which I heartily enjoyed, and to date I have never eaten more delicious fish that seemingly melted on the tongue like soft butter. So there you are, that is my story. I returned home to my house in Chicago to a tornado. Someone had broken into my house, and no prizes for guessing who was responsible. The vindictive lady from the garage sale was clearly looking for the jewelled box that I was now glad I no longer owned. Some of my priceless treasures that I had collected over many years had been hurled violently around the room, and even some were broken. Some of my furniture had even been ripped apart, but nothing had been taken. No, not one thing. But one thing was for sure, the jewellery box that I had purchased from that garage sale was the item that was being searched for in my house. It really had a hold over that woman, as it had over me. One day when I was in a restaurant ordering myself a steak dinner, I saw the horrible woman again that I had met at the yard sale. She actually pulled up a chair and begged me to sell her the jewelled box. I will pay double, she insisted, or triple if I have to, but I must have it. The expression on her face was desperate, reminding me so much of Gollum and the Ring. I told her that I had given the box to a Bigfoot who lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She got up, spat at me and said, "You make me sick," as if I'd believe such baloney. Interestingly enough, I was recently told by someone who knows a lot about the spiritual aspects of stones, is that the blue quartz bring order and courage to your life, releasing fear and enhancing spiritual development. Was the Bigfoot trying to tell me something about learning to be more courageous? Maybe I'll never know the answer to that. Needless to say, I was to discover that many people see the strange orbs of bright light over the Blue Ridge Mountains between dusk and early dawn. Some people believe they are extraterrestrial, others believe that they're ghostly spirits, and some a natural phenomenon. All I know is those lights were menacingly evil, and they were watching me with invisible eyes. Of that I am certain. I often think about how that ornate box gave me such a desire for it, to possess it, that momentary it suppressed my fear of those Bigfoots, that led to an extraordinary encounter that I might not have had if it hadn't been for that ounce of courage that that box gave me. So maybe that cursed box was a blessing after all. I just want to say I really loved that story. Thank you so much for sending it to me. I hope my snoring min pin didn't bother you in the background.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.